That's a pretty big group.
Yeah.
Good.
Right. Welcome everyone to another series of seminar talks. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Nicholas Arndt. He is emeritus professor of petrology, geochemistry at University of Grenoble Alpes, and president of Sisprobe, a small company that uses ambient noise seismology in mineral exploration. He has held academic positions in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Germany, and has worked in the minerals industry. His main research interests include petrology and geochemistry of mafic and ultramafic rocks, origin of continental crust and early Earth environment, magmatic ore deposits, and raw material supply chain. So without any further ado, the floor is yours, Dr. Arndt.
Okay, thanks, Mustafa. Thanks for the introduction. I'm pleased to be able to give a talk from here in Grenoble. I'm in Grenoble in France, in southeast France at the moment. So you see my title there, European Raw Materials Resilience. Now, what is resilience? This is a very fashionable term at the moment. It means the capacity of Europe to supply raw materials for its industry. And as I'll say a little bit later, this is a subject that worries some people, but for most it is of no interest whatsoever. And that's the reason for the who cares in my title. And I'll talk a little bit about what that's about. So I can't change there we go. I have to click to change it. So I'm going to start with these quotes, which I picked up from various sources in the last couple of months. The first one, something that really annoyed me, I have to say that right at the start. It comes from a BBC article, an article on the BBC in April of this year. The extraction industries are responsible for over 90% of biodiversity loss, according to United Nations' own Global Resources Outlook. And I said, is that right? Can that be right? The second one comes from a website of a little association, an NGO, which is against mining. They don't like mining anywhere. And they say there are credible alternatives to mining, stop production, and so on. You can read the rest. The third is more recent. This dates from about a month ago, and you see the authors there. It is the commission for a communication from the Commission of the European Parliament, the Council, the European Economic and Social Committee, and the Committee of the Regions. A short, snappy title of the type that Europe likes. This is a good report, and they talked about resilience, and they have phrases like this: access to resources and sustainability is the key to the European Union's resilience in relation to raw materials, and so on. It's a good report, but this is almost totally ignored by the mainstream media, by most people. And so these are the basic issues I'm going to be talking about. I'll be talking, this is the outline, which I'll follow fairly broadly. First, I'll talk about metals and mineral products, global supply and demand. What is happening now in terms of global supply and demand for metals. Then I'm going to go to Europe, talk a little bit more about the situation in Europe. And behind all this is public perception of mining, for better or for worse. So what is happening? You've seen this before. You know that global demand for all sorts of things, for energy, for base metals. Can you see my pointer, by the way? Is this visible, Mustafa?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so I'll use my pointer, my arrow to show what I'm talking about. Global demand for energy, all types of energy, demand for base metals and other types of metals is growing mainly, not totally, but in large part because population is increasing. And here's one estimation of how global population might increase to perhaps 8 billion in 2025, and so on. And accompanying this is a demand for and a consumption for different types of metals, for base metals, as we see here, but also a whole stream of other types of metals. used in new technology in the iPhones and electric cars and wind turbines. So you can ask the question, for the wind turbines, which we will have to build to provide renewable energy, the solar panels that will have to be built, the electric cars. Now this one's a Tesla Roadster, it's not particularly representative, but it seems fairly obvious that in the future, there'll be a lot more electric cars, which will need a whole bunch of different types of metals. More specifically, here we're looking at the different types of sources, the infrastructure needed to produce renewable energy. Hydro, which will continue to produce something. And what we see, the energy consumption produced by these different sources. Hydro will increase maybe slightly, but solar, wind will increase more rapidly. These sources of energies will become particularly important in the future, driven by the need to reduce consumption of fossil fuels to meet the challenges of global warming. And this type of infrastructure will require enormous amounts of raw materials. For example, here we're seeing the amount of steel that is required for the different types of sources of renewable energy. Not much for hydro, not much for nuclear, which is doesn't need very many raw materials and produces a lot of energy. Then we have gas, coal, which we'll get out of, and wind and solar energies here, which require large amounts of energy, of steel. Here's more specifically, these types of infrastructure needs not only steel, but glass and aluminium and copper and concrete and rare metals and so on in large amounts. A modern wind turbine offshore has a 1.5 tons of steel in it, and the magnet which it contains contains a ton of rare earths. So here's another graph which shows time here and tons of raw materials, all raw materials grouped together, and the amount that will be needed if by 2050 we're going to meet different scenarios of global warming. If we want to keep global warming to less than 2 degrees, it will require a significant increase in the total amount of metals and minerals that will have to be produced from somewhere. And here we see the types of metals that will be required. There's also the base metals, copper, zinc, for which the demand will have to be increased. But then we see this whole spectrum of new minerals. These metals and minerals will have to come from mining. There's no real other way, at least for many decades, to meet the demand. And I'll go into this a little bit later. But here we're seeing the sort of situation that is facing us. There'll be a growing demand for metals and mineral products of all types in the future. And here we see the breakdown. And here, this is an interesting conundrum. Here we see currently the amount of fuel, the amount of energy that is needed to produce metals today. And we see that 21% of global energy, 20% of global energy throughout the world was used for the production of steel and cement, a very large amount. We can add to this the amount of energy that's produced to extract and process other types of metals. And we see very clearly that mining and production of mineral products consumes a large amount of energy. And the amount of energy is increasing because as grades go down, this is happening globally, as grades go down, more rock has to be mined, which means that more energy is required to extract the ore. In addition to this, to produce concrete or to produce steel emits a lot of CO2. And we see the numbers here. So this is the situation currently. Mining and mineral production consumes a lot of energy and emits a lot of CO2. But as I've said before, if we're going to address the problems of global warming, we have to produce renewable energy, which will require, in order to build the infrastructure, large amount of energy. So we have this conundrum here. It seems that in the future, in the coming decades, there'll be a lot more mining, which will require a lot more energy, and we have this circular situation. Now, when these sort of arguments are advanced in discussions and debates, in many cases, we are told that the solution is recycling. Recycling, which is shown here in a diagram from one of the European programs I'll talk about later. The idea being that primary production will produce the materials that are used in industry. At the end of life of the metals and materials used in industry, they can be collected and recycled. And it is said that it's often said that recycling, what we call the closed loop, will eliminate the needs to produce primary materials. But clearly this is not the case, mainly because currently collection of used materials, of secondary materials, is not 100% efficient. Recycling is not 100% efficient either. This is a point worth recalling in contrast to oil and gas, which are gone once they're burnt. Metals can be recycled, but recycling is not 100% efficient, and the recycling and the collection is not that efficient. What I want to show now in this fancy change of slides, some work done by Olivier Vidal, who's a colleague of mine. And he always shows this peculiar picture on the left. I'm not sure what it means exactly, but we have a wolf and a sheep. And he uses this to illustrate the type of modeling he does. It's called prey and predator modeling. And it's a method used in biology to predict what happens when we have two types of population, a population of prey and a population of predators. So what commonly happens is the prey, the population of sheep will increase, and there's a whole bunch of sheep here, which means that the wolves have a lot to eat. The wolves will start eating the sheep until the population of sheep declines. Then there's no more food for the sheep and for the wolves, and the population of wolves declines as well. So there are methods to do this, shown roughly by these equations here. And this is what Olivier did. He applied the same sort of argument to metals, with the idea that resources of metals are the prey and consumption of metals is the predator. And he applied the models. He used in his models this type of scenario, which we see quite often, showing copper production, historical, used until about here, with the idea, which is found in many publications, the idea of peak copper, the idea that production of copper will reach a maximum and then decline as resources are exhausted. Now, I don't believe this for a minute, because I think there's enough resources of copper around to supply needs for a long time in the future. But Olivier used this. He used the red curve for his models, showing an increase in production to reach a maximum in about 2030, then a decline. And he considered then what would happen if copper production and consumption followed this curve for primary copper. And he considered what would happen if, as time went on, the amount of copper, secondary copper, in end-of-life products gradually increased. He said there would be a time lag between the time the primary copper is incorporated in electric cars or wind turbines or whatever, and the end of life of these products, which mean that secondary copper would come onto the market. So there's a curve like this for the recycled component. And if you put the two together, primary copper declining, copper for recycling increasing, the total production falls a curve rather like this, reaching some sort of stabilization in around 2050. So if recycling can go on, and remember, copper can be recycled many times. The copper is used to build an iPhone. The iPhone is reprocessed and the copper is used for something else. Metals can be recycled multiple times. If this is taken into account, total production might stabilize and the balance of primary copper and recycled copper will meet consumption needs sometime in the future, maybe 2050, 2060. In addition to this, we have to consider that the projection of expanding global population is probably not accepted by everybody now. We used to talk about populations of 10 billion, 11 billion, but now the more probable scenarios are probably something like this. Probably in most places, population increase will decline for a very simple reason that mainly it's the women become educated, their fertility rate drops down, and as we have seen very clearly in Korea, South Korea, for example, throughout Southeast Asia, throughout South America, to a lesser extent in Africa, but this is starting, population will probably reach some sort of stable level towards the end of this century. And in combination with this, the demand for metals will probably form curves like this. Here, these three curves are for Japan, for USA, for Europe, in which per capita consumption of metals is stabilized. In China, the curve is probably something like this. In India, we have this one, and the rest of the world is this one. So even though what will happen eventually is that consumption of metals will reach maturity, and for this reason and for this reason, combined with the increasing amount of copper, of metals available for recycling, the whole situation will stabilize. So we can make this statement. Maybe around 2050, 2060, global production of copper and other metals will satisfy demand because of stabilizing global population, because of the maturity of the consumption in these countries, and in increasing recycling. So that's the long-term view. But what I want to talk about is Europe. What's happening in Europe? You may have seen this type of diagram, which I like a lot, which illustrates very nicely that Europe is a major importer of almost all metals and not a producer. Now, I realized when I was looking at this slide that Canada is squashed. Poor old Canada is hardly seen in this. We have Europe, we have USA, and Europe as major importers. We have Australia, China, South America as major producers. And here we have Europe with some production in Ireland, in Scandinavia, this is Poland, and in the southeastern Europe, Greece, and eastern countries. But basically, Europe is a major importer of almost all metals. Here we see some figures showing the percentage of different types of metals imported into Europe. Some copper is produced. Copper is produced in several parts of Europe. From Poland is the biggest producer. There's some in Scandinavia. There's some in Eastern and Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. Zinc, quite a lot of zinc is produced in Ireland and so on. So for some metals, the proportion of the domestic production makes 50 or up to about 80%. But for most metals, for important metals, the great proportion is supplied by imports. Europe is dependent, European industry, European society is dependent on imports. Now, this always struck me as a bit of a paradox because in Europe, there's a lot of discussion about the need to be self-sufficient for food products. So the agricultural sector has received strong support from the European Union of the order of 60 billion per year. It's dropping a little bit now, but not much. So for decades, there's a lot of support for agriculture and zero support for industry. Nobody cared about the fact, for example, that almost all the platinum group metals consumed necessary for European industry were imported. Imported from where? From South Africa, Russia, and Zimbabwe, the main producers, countries which are not particularly stable. But this didn't worry people. This didn't worry the politicians, didn't worry the general public at all. And industry, well, industry simply said, well, the metals will arrive on boats in main harbors in Europe. We don't have to worry about that. This changed a little in 2008, 2009, when China, for various reasons, decided to restrict exports of rare earth elements. Now, before this, almost nobody outside the geochemistry community had heard of rare earth elements. Suddenly, with the measures taken by the Chinese government authorities, people became aware of it because rare earths are used in magnets, which are found in all sorts of appliances. In fact, the main trigger for the crisis came from the Pentagon when they realized that the magnets used to guide their drones and missiles came from magnets in which the rare earths were produced in China. And they said, this is not a good situation to be in. So China restricted the exports of raw materials. They put limits on the amount of rare earths that could be exported. This caused an immediate increase in the price of these metals, which led to a lot of exploration, which in fact didn't produce, probably has produced a few ongoing mines, but not many. It was a small, sudden crisis. As it happened, the export quotas, the amount of rare earths exported from China never reached the export limits, in large part because a lot of rare earth was simply smuggled out of China by various ways. Anyway, the main point is China imposed limits to the amount of rare earths they could export, and this led to a reaction. It led to a reaction throughout the world. US is still worried about this, and Europe was worried. They started to suddenly realize that it's probably not a good situation to be in when the continent has to import almost all the metals that are essential for its industry. And this led to the spawning of a number of different programs, some of which I say here, the European Innovation Partnership of Raw Materials, which is doing well. Horizon 2020, which is the main funding vehicle of the European Union, has various programs, and here's another one, IRAMIN, yet another program where they talk about primary resources, secondary resources, substitution, public policy, and so on. And these programs are ongoing, and they're doing a lot of good. They're addressing questions like the situation we see here, when on the left, we see known ore deposits in Europe. In a debate, an online debate a couple of weeks ago with people from the European Union, in fact, I asked the question, why don't these people in Brussels worry about metal imports? Why don't they promote more mining in Europe? And the response from one of the people on the panel was, well, there's no ore. There's no possibilities to mine in Europe. Everything's everything, all the deposits are exhausted. This is clearly not the case. There's a lot of deposits that are known. Probably a lot more will be found if modern exploration techniques were used in Europe. But this is not really not happening. And you see it's not happening when you look at the diagram on the right, where we see the areas where exploration is going on. In Ireland, in Scandinavia, in the countries of Eastern Europe, some in Greece, and in the Iberian Peninsula. And where we see almost no exploration going on is in the countries in the center, the main populous countries, France and Germany, which really guide a lot of the decisions that are made in Brussels. Exploration only around the fringe, but not in populous countries. And there's a sentiment that mining cannot be done in Europe because it's too expensive, because the charges are too high, whatever, which is not the case. And here I give two examples. This is the Aitik mine of Boliden. It's a porphyry copper deposit. It's a mine that's situated in the north of Sweden in a pretty stringent climate, social and environmental. The mine has to operate in this climate, respecting all the social requirements in Sweden, and yet the grade of copper which is produced here the average grade is 0.27%, which is roughly half the average grade of copper mined in the world. This is another example. This is the zinc lead mine in Ireland, the Lachine mine, which operated for about 20 years and has subsequently closed. It was an underground mine, relatively compact. It's subsequently been restored, and this is the situation. The mine was here, and restoration has been very successful. So mining can be done cleanly, respecting social and environmental norms in Europe. But in many parts of Europe, mining is probably, if not impossible, very difficult, because there's too much resistance to the idea. Here we see a photo taken from a region in the west of France. The town is called Tenay. The region is called Rues. And here we see a demonstration which happened when a small company called Variskin Mining was given the first exploration permit to be granted in France for about 20 years. This small company, which was launched by geologists from the BRGM, the French Geological Survey, tried to do things properly. Before they started their exploration, before they started their geophysical surveys, they went to all the villages around the area where they wanted to do their surveys and explained what they wanted to do. They wanted to start geophysical surveys to see if there were any exploitable deposits in the area. About 3 weeks later, in all the villages, movements had been established whose goal was to prevent any exploration. And here's their motto: no to mines, not in Rues, not anywhere. They didn't want to see any mining anywhere. And this is where this first quote comes from the communique, the press release from this site, which opposed all mining. And they said there's credible alternatives. So this is the way I see it. It would be rather difficult to open mines in most parts of France and in most parts of the main countries in Europe. And why is this? In part, it's because mining has very bad press, particularly in Europe. Less in Canada. I had a quick look at the press in Canada, in the mainstream media and some social platforms. And in Canada, the opinion seems to be mixed, but generally positive. There's generally a positive attitude to mining. And I'd be very interested to hear your feedback about this. But certainly it's not the case in France where I am, and certainly it's not the case in most most European countries, and why is this? For various reasons. For example, this here, Mines 23, Mine 23, is a website set up specifically to oppose mining, to oppose the project of Variscan mines. And they succeeded. They succeeded in halting exploration in the Ruez area. Variscan mines then tried again in Brittany. And again, there was a social movement leading to abandonment of the project by Variscan mine. And in West France, which is the local newspaper, there was this headline announcing that the mining projects of Variscan mines were definitively buried. And West France was very happy about this. I subscribe to a program called Earthworks, which is based in the US, but it's global. And they say they're for responsible mining, but in fact, they seem to oppose most mining operations they talk about. So here we had a message sent to me, Dear Nicholas, Chelsea Doe, a young Earthworks supporter, has started to produce bracelets made out of feathers and cloth and vegetable products, instead of being made out of precious metals, because she wants to limit the harmful effects of mining. She knows that mining pollutes our environment and destroys land and forests. And then there's this one here from the BBC, an article called How to Mine Precious Metals in Your Home. In fact, it's about urban mining, and the article's okay. But we find this quote: the extraction industries are responsible for over 90% of biodiversity loss, according to this report. But what do we find in this report? Here's the quote again. It's in the report. Here's the quote. It's a little bit different, but 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress are caused by resource extraction and processing. A statement illustrated by here, which is clearly a mine. And the message passed in this report, it's a good report, but things can be twisted. The message can be twisted because it turns out that in this report, the term extraction industries applies to material use in households, fossil fuels, fair enough, non-metallic minerals, quarrying, fair enough, metals, but biomass. There's biomass as well. And if we look at land use related to biodiversity loss, these are metals. This is mining as we would normally know it. This is quarrying. This is fossil fuels. This is households. And this is biomass. And what is biomass in their definition? Crops, grazed biomass, pastures, also timber, also fisheries. So this quote is totally misleading, but this reflects to some extent the way the message can be twisted in a lot of the media outlets. Now I want to go and talk about another slightly different issue. That's the effect of the coronavirus. And you may already have seen this joke here, but anyway. But I'm going to talk specifically about one reaction to the coronavirus pandemic, which were the calls for the reactions against globalization, calls for protectionism. Illustrated here. So here we see one headline, COVID-19 forces France to look at relocating its pharmaceutical industry. When the virus immediately started to spread in France, it was realized that a lot of the pharmaceuticals, a lot of the masks, a lot of the ventilators were coming from China. And it was said that European pharmaceutical industry should not be dependent on imports. The same thing applied to vehicles. Here in France, again, there's a call to repatriate vehicle manufacturing from elsewhere back to Europe. And the same thing in Germany. And we say this poor lost VW next to the VW factory. So there's a lot of discussion about repatriation of industry, relocalizing sources of production. But in none of this was anything much said about mining, local production, which I thought was a little strange. I thought I make a parallel between what is called the locavore movement, the idea that we should consume what is produced within a 100-kilometer radius of where we live, which makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I tend to do this, not always, but I think that it makes a lot of sense to consume products which are grown locally because it provides jobs. It means the money you spend to buy these products goes to the local community and so on. It makes a lot of sense. Associated with this movement is the term food miles. The idea we should limit the number of miles between the site of production of green beans or whatever and the site of consumption. But I asked the question, well, why don't we talk about metal miles? Why does it make much sense to, well, not much metals produced in Australia are consumed in Europe, but they come from elsewhere. Copper comes from Chile in large part and so on. Why don't we talk about metal miles? And the reason we don't is simply that currently there's too much resistance to the ideas of mines in our backyard, local production of mines. This is the situation. I'm not sure what, if anything, can be done about it. We're going to talk about this. When I say we, this is a group which is currently organizing a session which will take place beneath the dinosaurs in the Natural History Museum in London. In fact, this was the original idea, but it's going to be virtual, like most meetings nowadays. We have good panels, which are going to address questions like this. Where do the metals come from in Europe and elsewhere? What is the role of mining when we talk about global sustainability goals, when we talk about the challenges posed by global warming and so on? How can mining fit in this? What can we do to decrease the environmental impact of mining, make it more sustainable? Issues like this. So here's the mine side, the website, Can Mining Make the World a Greener Place.com. And I would encourage you to go and look at this, follow the sessions, which will be online in early December, and hear a little bit more about the issues I've been talking about. So that's it. Relatively short, but I don't like to talk too long. We'll be talking, basically what I would conclude is that at least for the next decades, we'll need lots of metals of all types, metals we haven't even imagined that we'll need. Just think about it. We never had any idea 2 decades ago of the metals we are using now. The needs will change, the requirements have changed, but there's no way of getting around the fact that we'll need to increase production, not only of the critical metals that everybody talks about, but also the commonplace metals. Recycling will play a role. Recycling will play a role in a couple of decades when there's enough secondary resource available, there's enough stock available for recycling. And gradually, as global population stabilizes and so on, we will reach some sort of equilibrium in a couple of decades, maybe by 2050, 2060, whatever. In the meantime, Europe will continue to be dependent on imports of most of its metals, despite the programs which are underway to increase resilience. Maybe these programs will have some effect, but most of the metals consumed in Europe will be produced everywhere. Even though this seems counter to the idea that we should support local production, local consumption of local products, the press, the mainstream press, the social networks will continue to make things difficult, make it difficult to reach these goals. And that's what I wanted to say. So Mustafa, I'll pass over to you. I'll be very happy to answer questions, to hear comments. I'd be interested to hear what you think in Canada, in a mining country, in a country where mining is important, in a country where my impression is that mining has much better public perception than in Europe. I'd be very interested to hear what you think about the issues I've been talking about.
I'll say something. It's Mike. You know, I have two comments. One is, one reason metals get shipped so far is because it costs nothing. I mean, Glencore mines ore and produces a concentrate up at Raglan. They ship it around to Montreal. It gets loaded onto a train and it goes up to here to Sudbury and gets smelted. And then it goes back by train to Montreal, gets loaded on another ship, goes all the way over to Norway and gets refined over there. And then from there, it probably goes to Japan to make the steel, because we don't make steel anymore in Canada in any extreme amount. So, and part of that's just the economics. Like, it adds nothing almost to the cost to do that, because the shipping is so inexpensive compared to building a smelter or building a refinery or building a mine. So that's
sure.
Just one comment.
No, I agree with you, Mike. The same thing applies to Iceland, which is one of the biggest aluminium producers, using refining bauxite from Ghana or wherever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, well, you go where the energy is, you know, and so there's a vast difference between even Ontario and Quebec in that respect, because of the hydropower in Quebec, because all the LG dams and that sort of thing. So that the other point is the NIMBY issue, not in my backyard. And you know, I probably wouldn't want to mine in my backyard. I don't want
one
in my city.
You've got one. You've got a bunch of mines in Sudbury.
But they're not in my backyard, right? And there are even cases in Sudbury where people have little mini crushing facilities behind their cottages on Lake Panage. There's a big debate. There's a guy that's doing that you can see at PDAC every year, and he's got he mines some rock over on the other side of the lake, barges it across, drives it across the road, you know, the North Shore Road in Panage, and then crushes it right next to somebody's summer cottage, you know?
Yeah.
Nobody wants that. Whereas Canada's got so much landscape, Australia's got so much landscape where the population density is so low, northern Sweden, northern Finland, keep going. Those are the places where it's really easy to build a mine. And that's where the exploration is, in those areas, because people support mining because it doesn't necessarily have to be in their backyard.
Fair enough.
You're going to be building.
I keep on making a parallel with farming.
But there's a big difference between having a field of grapes and in France and having an open pit, whatever kind of mine you'd have in France.
It's just, well, yes, mines are dustier, but they don't take up much space. And really, agriculture, it's not just, it's terrible, but for biodiversity, for pollution, and so on. But everybody accepts agriculture. Huh? And also, the first point you make about cost of shipping, sure, it's true, but that applies to food as well. A lot of the arguments for local production, the notion of food miles makes no sense, because the cost of shipping is different, and often it makes a lot more sense to grow the tomatoes or whatever in France. We get stuff from Northern Africa, and that makes a lot of ecological sense to do that. But these things are not talked about.
Well, they're burning you know, the carbon up in the stratosphere because they're flying it in. So that's way worse than
No, shipping it in.
Clean a ship is, but
Shipping it in. Oh, shit, I mean, you just said this, the cost of shipping metals is not much, which I agree with you.
yeah.
Okay, well, there's a chap here from
Yeah.
Michaels, Smichiels. Does he want to have ask the question? We need to promote green mining. What's that mean?
Well, this is a big thing in Canada.
Uh-huh.
It's a very big thing in Canada. And if you study the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan that's being launched in this country, you'll see that there's a strong focus, because it's the only way that you may be able to come against the environmental push is by showing people that there are ways of reclamation as part of the mining cycle. And there are ways of restoring, and we do a very poor job of showing good cases of reclamation and how land is returned to its pristine original condition. And we do have samples of that right here in Manitoba, Canada. But I mean, we do need to let the public know. And as you say, the media doesn't help the message. They look for the negatives. That's what sells for them.
Sure.
So they're not going to help.
I tend to agree with you, but I also know that somebody once said, is green mining an oxymoron? And it's contradictory. Can you have green mining? And I'm not sure, because again, I'm going to be playing the devil's advocate here. Now, I've been in one of the programs I'm involved with, there's a woman from the Irish Geological Survey, and she is conducting programs to study public perception of mining. And she did her work in Ireland, and she knew the Lachine mine and the mines in all the mines in Ireland, which are very underground mines, very properly done. And she was, saying this is the way it should be done and how mining can be done properly. And then she came to Spain, to the Rio Tinto area, and she saw the open pits, the enormous open pits, which are pretty nasty. And she suddenly revised her opinion. She said, well, no, maybe these people who oppose mining have something, have a good argument. It's not straightforward.
No, it's not straightforward, but I think there's a lot of work that could be done to showcase when companies are accountable and when they do the reclamation part of the mining cycle correctly. And a lot of them don't. There's been a very poor history. Those Rio Tinto mines, I don't know when that was in Spain, but that's quite some time ago.
No, it's current. It's ongoing.
It's ongoing. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a disgrace to that company. Because if they do want to be good corporate citizens and they have to embrace the reclamation, otherwise just take it out of the mining cycle and pretend it's not there anymore.
Yeah. I remember another story. I'm sorry, I'm telling stories here, but I took a guy from Germany with me to collect rocks in northern Saskatchewan. And he's just a geochemist, but he came along and we took him to Flin Flon. And he was horrible. He's never seen mines before. And he spent his whole time taking photographs of the mines. And then he came back to Germany and gave slideshows showing how terrible mining is. I really don't know how we, what can be done to improve the image of mining, because
well, I think to improve the image of mining, you have to do it right. And that's why I'm saying that I think we're leaving out the reclamation piece and just pretending it's not really there. And when it is done, we do have some cases that are very, very good that showcase that. But when it's not, then you've got a mess. And then, yes, you do have a bad reputation, and it's very hard to make it go away.
Yeah. Because then you have the situation like what Rio Tinto did in Australia, when they destroyed these Aboriginal caves, which is criminal. Really, and what's happened in Vale with Vale and BHP in Brazil, when they were saying that the tailings dams are secure, and then they burst. They were saying we do things properly, and then you have these catastrophes. It's a rather difficult job to defend the industry in many ways. Yet, as I said, there's no alternative. We're going to have mining. And where is it going to be done? Maybe, I think a lot of it will be done in Canada and in Australia, where usually it's done properly. But a lot of it will be done in Africa and other places where it will not be done so well. These are the problems.
Well, if I could just weigh in here for a second. I mean, a lot of these deposits with, environmental quote unquote disasters, they're all massive sulfide deposits. So it doesn't necessarily speak for all different, types of commodities. I mean, Borden, one of Goldcorp now Newmont's mines, I mean, it's all, they've got all electric equipment underground. And they're doing great things, and that's just northwest of Sudbury. Yeah. But just to raise a point of, I mean, a lot of these examples are, very old deposits that have been producing for a long time, and most of them are massive sulfide that have a lot of these, environmental hiccups with them.
Well, yes and no, but the catastrophes in Brazil were iron mines.
Well, yeah.
Iron mines and same thing in Rio Tinto. That was an iron mine as well. Rio Tinto in Australia. No, this is what the message that has to be tried to be communicated, that mining can be done properly, and efforts are being made to make it be done better. But in some ways, it's an uphill battle.
Just to follow up, this is Paul Binney in Sudbury. And just to follow up on the communication comment, I think that the mining industry, and of course, Sudbury, major mining town, and I worked in the industry for about 35 years, but what the industry tends to do is they let the unions speak about mining. So mining is portrayed as an extremely dangerous thing to be doing at all times. They let the environmentalists speak about mining. And of course, they have a very negative sense to it. And they let the government speak about mining. And the government seems to be much more focused on the fact that the Aboriginal rights trump any mining lease that the government might actually issue. So the one thing I think is you're being very optimistic when you're saying that Canada, and speaking specifically from Ontario, is going to be a future hotbed for mining, because I see that unless the mining companies learn to speak for themselves, the only time they do speak for themselves is the Prospectors and Developers Convention, and that, amongst everyone else, is known as a huge drunk in Toronto where 15,000 people get together and eat fancy food, drink expensive wine, and schmooze. So the industry has made their own bed in some cases.
Yeah, no, I agree to some extent. A lot of that's true. But what's going to happen? The mining will. You can't. If everybody is a NIMBY, then no mining is done anywhere. And maybe it'll all be done in China. China and Chinese-owned companies in Africa. Is that the future? Is that where we're all going to get our metals?
I think your points about not in my backyard and the total unawareness of the average person. Most people don't even realize that if they go to the store and they buy a steak, that came from a cow. How can we expect them to know that when they go to Apple and buy an iPhone, that's actually metals?
Yeah. No, I have a very bleak scenario for Europe. Where I'm talking from. I don't see this situation changing much until for various reasons, the gap between Europe and the rest of the world, what we call the developing world, decreases. And if Europe sometime in the future no longer has the wherewithal to buy metals from outside, then maybe then there will be mining, but it's not going to happen immediately. So is that going to happen in Canada? A question to everybody. We've got more chats here.
Yeah, in the chat. Do you want me to read it? Mining industry from Alexandria.
Okay, I'm reading Alexandria from him.
Mining industry becomes really complex when media is just showing the negative sides of it, as those disasters like Rio Tinto in Australian Valley with the Brumadinho Dam failure, but it also depends on regulation and control from government. So pretty much the statement. Yeah.
Well, I think if I become more optimistic, I can say, yes, things are changing. And Alexandra talked about regulation and control. And to some extent that is happening, because for tailings dams, there was a international commission, I've forgotten which one it was, that has come up with new standards for monitoring tailings dams, tailings facilities. And these are being put into place, and maybe that'll improve the safety of tailings dams, which were the cause of the disaster in Brazil.
Yeah, it has been, sorry, it's Alexandra.
Okay.
It has been more with the global standard tailings review and with all this information that it has been gathered about all the tailings, but mostly about mining. It doesn't only have to be just massive sulfides or everything. Now society, for example, in South America, it's becoming really hard to put a mine in place, even when you show the positive what it is. Mm-hmm. With the government, it's so difficult to get a mine right now. Or if you say in your project that you're going to have a tailings dam or even a tailings deposit, that's it. That environmentally it's shut down and the project cannot continue, because that's the only thing we are seeing is all these disasters. And I think we are failing as mining people or working in mining to promote and to show how it can be done well. Like, we only show the bad samples, but we need also to show how some good projects have been done in Canada for years, in Australia, in Brazil as well. And we are failing on it. It's also depend a lot on us that we are working.
Yeah, it's true. It's very true, but that's difficult. But as somebody said before, it's disasters are news. The train that arrives on time is not news. A mine that operates properly is not news. And the media only pick up the disasters. And I don't really see any way around that. See, the other thing, again, coming back to Europe, I asked the question, well, why is the mining why does nobody ever talk about the mining industry, the need for metals, when everybody talked about the Corona crisis and the need to relocalize, repatriate industry? And the main industry, one of the main industries that mining in Europe makes a negligible proportion of the global economy. We don't have they're not the lobbyists, and they're not the people who can promote it. There's not the farmers' lobbies who are behind any measure to reduce the subsidies for agriculture, for example. And this is the situation.
Right.
There's another question. It depends on us. Depends on the will of government. Yeah. Well, maybe we can, the next part is we can't afford to enter the dark age of non-mining and return to the Stone Age approach.
Yeah.
Or maybe there'll be a crunch sometime in the in the future, but I don't see how this is going to work out. You see, I'm pretty I'm in a pessimistic phase. Usually I'm more optimistic, but now my outlook is pretty pessimistic.
I can see that, but I do agree with you. I do agree with you in some of the things about Europe and how I think they will need another crisis or another big fall in the market that they cannot get to realize everything they have in Europe. Like they keep improving on these critical raw material lists, and they keep improving and increasing the list. I mean, they just add a few months ago more elements to these critical raw materials. But then when you look at the mining projects, they say, oh yeah, just leave it to the Finnish, just leave it to the Swedish. But you see Germany, France, it's the mining in France for metals, it's already done.
It's gone, yeah.
That you don't have.
Hmm?
There are no exploration projects, and they leave everything to the Scandinavians. Like, for example, now I'm in Portugal, and they are making it so difficult to work in the mining.
I agree. You know, I talked to people from the BRGM, the French survey, who are doing compilations, documenting all deposits everywhere in Europe and looking at resources where they exist, even in France. And I asked them, well, why are you doing that? Because you realize, you know, it's impossible to mine in France, given the public sentiment. You know, fracking was, you're not even allowed to explore for tight gas. And the response from the people in BRGM is, yes, but we have to do this for the future when there's a change in mindset. And I said, well, maybe, yeah. Will this happen? When will this happen? I'm not sure when.
Yeah, it's so complicated. They also BRGM, they are doing all this. I was reading some reports about the tailings and the mine waste facilities. They are doing it all about Europe. And,
yeah.
And I mean, there are some sites that they forget. Like I have seen so many ads in mine drainage, and they are not even working on the rehabilitation or remediation of these areas. And when you look at the analysis, you got to characterize these mining waste. You have so many of these critical elements that they are calling, but still it's not allowed to work on it. So the future is when?
Yeah, I don't know. No? This is it. The change in mindset is a couple of decades away, when the position of Europe in the global economy might have changed. It's very pessimistic. Well, it depends. It depends where you think it's fair to be, and countries like Canada to be living at a level which is much better than most of the world. I think that inequality is unethical, unsustainable, and maybe the situation eventually will be reduction of that gap, and then maybe Europe will recognize that it's totally unethical and irresponsible to depend on the rest of the world to supply their metals, because they don't like the pollution engendered by mining. This is an immoral situation, in my opinion, but it's not widely changed. Whoop. Just a second. Sorry, that was my phone. Stopped. Hi, Louise. I can see you.
Well, I wanted to say a few things that are positive. Being a field geologist who have had the chance of working in collaboration with industry on exploration camps, I have been amazed at the quality of the environmental studies that are done pre-mining. And that's something that nobody talks about, but that was just absolutely stunning to see how much environmental studies were done in the Northwest Territories next to the region of a future mine. And nobody talks about that. And it should be said. It also should be said that First Nations are starting to develop their own mineral exploration companies. And for example, the Dene First Nation in the Northwest Territories has founded the Danish mining and exploration company, DEMCO. And it's 27 or 28 First Nation of the Dene Nation that joined together to make that exploration companies. What I've seen in the field also is that strong regulation and having people who do check up how things are progressing, and government being involved and looking at making sure that everything, all the rules and regulations are very, very strictly followed. And if something is just not perfect, just to be there, right? Very, very quickly fix things, and having students with our crews and having First Nation on our crews as well, made people a lot more aware of what it was to conduct exploration for future mining. And I think that we need to talk about that a lot more. Tell our students, I think we have a major role to bring, before even we care about the whole population, just informing our own students, undergrads and grad students, about what is being done is very, very important. And then they inform around them. But if we cannot even convince our own students of the importance, then we are failing. And I think we have, every one of us have fantastic stories to tell about, the efforts of mining in the 21st century. And that should be heard a lot more.
I
So
agree.
that's what I wanted to say.
Good. Thanks. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, what do they say?
I think Michael left a message in here.
Left a message and then had to run.
Yeah, the mining companies are their own worst enemies, leaving ugly brown fields behind, mining low-grade deposits that produce mountains of waste rock and tailing that need dams that fail. We need more small underground mines.
Yeah.
Is that feasible, making small underground mines? Like if you have a deposit, do it in small underground mines?
That's what they say in Europe as well. They say these programs say we've got to develop new techniques to find small mines. And I think it's totally ridiculous.
Yeah, how to find it? It's very hard.
We're not
Geophysically, we will have a hard time.
Demand with a bunch of small mines, need big mines as well. But things are happening here. The block caving methods means you can have large-scale, efficient underground mining. Maybe things will go a lot more in that direction. I don't know.
All right. If there's no any other questions, that was a very long conversation here. It was very productive. So I thank you again, Arndt, and for very interesting talk. And thank you everyone for joining. So
thank you as well. Thanks for the questions.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.